Hi, it's Mark Bernard here with the Bernard Institute for Cybersecurity Excellence, and I'm creating a short video to talk about frameworks. There's a lot of talk about frameworks, and I just want to clear up some of the confusion maybe around the purpose of frameworks and also the differences between laws and industrial regulations. So let's, without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so there are numerous laws, national laws and international laws. You probably recognize some of these. These are very popular. Compliance managers recognize these. Probably some cybersecurity professionals recognize these as well. FISMA, FedRAMP, HITECH, GDPR, CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, GLBA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, HIPAA, and CPPA, Canadian Consumer Protection Act. So there's quite a few laws that are out there, and of course laws are treated very differently because the penalty for not following the law, of course, could be prison time or something like that. So laws are very important, and of course every board of directors and executive team are very keen on making sure that the compliance team is taking care of following the laws. Now, similar to laws are regulations. So sometimes the regulators want clients to feel as if their regulations were actually laws because they're kind of treated similarly, but they have a different consequence. So where laws, if you break, you could go to jail. If you break a regulation, chances are you won't go to jail. There may be a penalty or there may be some additional security work that you have to do in order to comply, or compliance work in order to comply with that regulation. And here's a few examples. PCI DSS, it's not a law, it's regulation. ISAE as well. SOC 2, SSAE, these are popular with the accounting people, and they're self-regulated. So a lot of industries self-regulate, like with PCI DSS, it's MasterCard and Visa that are self-regulating the payment industry. And with ISA, SOC 2, and SSAE 18, this is the financial accountants, the AICPA, the American Institute for Professional Accounting, that's regulating their own industry. And then there's the New York DFS. So that's the New York financial people, banks primarily, that are doing their own regulation for cybersecurity. ITAR, NERC-CIP, and CMMC, and NIST 2. So NIST 2 is European, the other three are American. These are all regulations, they're not laws. So how do they compare to frameworks? Well, we have several good frameworks around, as you know. ISO 27001, ISMS, Information Security Management System, is probably the #1 global framework. Closely behind that probably is NIST, Special Publication 853-5, and NIST Cybersecurity Framework. ITIL is also very popular, COBIT, SAP HANA HEC, and CSA STAR. These are all examples. This is not an exclusive, complete list of laws, regulations, and frameworks, but I just wanted you to see the difference between them so that we can continue the discussion about frameworks. Now, do laws and regulations provide sort of a framework structure? In a way, yes, they can. Laws probably are less specific than industry regulations. As you know, if you've done any of these SOC 2 or PS or PCI standards, you know the level of detail that's required. It's pretty extensive, but they're not frameworks. So they're just regulations. So regulations fit into, like laws, fit into frameworks. Frameworks help to, I guess, pave the way to compliance. Okay, let's keep going. So what happens if you don't comply with a law or a regulation, or you don't follow a framework? Well, you could end up with business continuity issues. So for instance, if you don't have a documented standard or procedure, what happens when you have a failure? You have no way of recovering, basically. You don't want to leave it up to tacit knowledge and the experience of people, as opposed to having a plan that's been tested and reviewed a few times in order to make sure that it's going to work. Knowledge management, of course, if knowledge is not documented, then there's a huge problem because you could lose that knowledge. This is really important because small mom and pops and other types of businesses, they rely more on the people than they do on the process. These people have knowledge inside of their minds that help make their businesses successful. And of course, once you get successful, you want to be able to document that success so that you can do it over and over again. So knowledge management is really important in order to be able to share that knowledge with new people coming on board and with team members. From a quality management perspective, it's also very important because if you don't document the path and follow the path, then there's no way to improve the path. So you can't improve tacit knowledge. That's not possible. But if you have explicit knowledge, which is documented knowledge, then it's possible for you to review the process and make tweaks or improvements to that process. So from a risk management perspective, without documented procedures or standards, the enterprise services and products may fail to be delivered. There's a number of reasons, as we've already mentioned. The loss of knowledge, business continuity issues. These are all risks. Quality management, the lack of quality is a risk. It will certainly impede the growth of the enterprise. And finally, compliance management, which is probably the most obvious, so I left it to the last. But compliance management is very, very important. With no records, you have no evidence of any procedures or standards being followed. You have no way to improve the quality of them. You have no way to transfer that knowledge, and you have definitely no way to recover from a bad situation like an outage. So these are all risks to the organization. This is why we follow frameworks. Now, not to shock you too much, but this is just in the U.S., of course. Did you know that there's over 4,000 laws for businesses? And you combine that, the number of laws and the number of rules that we have to follow as corporate entities operating outside within the U.S., with the fact that the cybercrime risks are growing. So cybercrime groups are exploiting vulnerabilities in technology and in business processes and standards. This is why it's also important for us to document them and improve them so that we can harden our systems and make it less attractive, or maybe not 100% impregnable. Impregnable would be nice, but certainly we want it to be resilient. I think that's a buzzword that's been used for the last 5-10 years. So resilience, we want to make sure that our organization can withstand any kind of attack. But the fact is, there's a lot of laws. On the previous page, I only mentioned about maybe 25 or 30 different laws, regulations, and standards or frameworks. And there's 4,300 laws and 88,000 rules. So you can imagine 88,000 control points on any system is enough to choke it. So we have to be very strategic when we implement frameworks. Let's take an example, for instance. Let's talk about the General Data Protection Regulation Matrix, because this is one that's been talked about quite a bit. Within this law, there are 99 articles. So you could look at those 99 articles as being 99 different risks or control points that need to be managed. We're going to focus on a couple of the key areas. In Chapter 2, Chapter 3, Articles 7 to 24 or something, we're going to focus on the principles and the rights of the data subject. I did a little bit of analysis on this to help us get through this. And so here we have, you can see Article 5 to 11, that basically lists all of the principles of privacy, or GDPR. There's 7 principles, okay? And then within the rights of the data subject, which is very important because that's you or me, right? There's 13 different control points. So we're going to talk about how we could use a framework to satisfy these 2 sections of GDPR. Okay, so I went through and again, I did a little bit of analysis. You can see I looked at what it would take to achieve these. So I went down through the principles. The principles, we could basically write a privacy policy and include the principles, make sure that that is shared with contractors and employees, do a little maybe education and awareness with them, and help them get up to speed on what's required when it comes to handling personal information. And then I went down through the different control points here, and I also added what I think needs to be applied. So for instance, transparency requires an audit plan, because you're going to have to do some kind of arm's length reach objective audit of your control systems in order to make sure that they are working properly. So that's what transparency is all about, is making sure that you can prove that your processes are working. And audit is used by the executive team and the board of directors to make sure that we are doing what we said we were going to do from an operations perspective. Then I look at information and access to personal information. I think, well, we have procedures, we have information handling procedures, we have maybe some more policies, more procedures for right to erasure or rectification. We also have more procedures and policies. So procedures and policies and standards here is the data classification. So type of restrictions that we have, that's talking about data classification, very specific controls like encryption. So again, this group of articles, 5 to 10, would make up a great privacy policy. And then we have 12 articles that will help define the rights to the subject. They need to be written up with an audit plan, some policies and procedures and standards. So it's a little bit more complicated because these are more hands-on. This is more instructional. We're telling them what the executives want us to do when it comes to compliance with GDPR. Now I took popular framework, ISO 27001, the only really truly internationally accepted cybersecurity framework. And this is the new version, 2022. And you can see that it has a number of clauses, 4 to 10, for the management system. These are mandatory. And then it has a number of other controls that are to be integrated into operations. And there's 93 controls here within these 4 groups. And then I've mapped those to GDPR, and I've come up with the following list. So from the management system, there's several control points that need to be recorded. So obviously we need to have leadership. We need to have an information security management system, because that provides the framework for the framework, the management system for the framework. Documentation needs to be available as information. So I've just pulled out a few random clauses here. That's 53A, ensuring that the information security management system conforms to the standard, this standard here. 612, the organization shall define all information security risk. So we need to do a risk assessment for exposures to the handling of personally identifiable information. And then we need to retain that documentation as evidence, and we need to conduct internal audits. So that's all part of the management system. Now there's 4 other groups, if you recall, for organizational controls. So we need to have policies. We talked about the need for that. We need to have management to be involved and be responsible. We need to have an inventory of all of our personally identifiable information holdings. Okay? We need to classify it and label it as such so that it gets handled properly. Managing information security and the communication technology. So we want to make sure that the supply chain and also any telecommunications that we're doing has the appropriate level of control. We want to make sure that we're complying with all legal, regulatory, and contractual obligations. So we talked about the legal and the regulatory, and we didn't talk about contract. I think I'll do that in a different video because it's a little bit more complicated. And we talked about the need to protect records. So that's a control point. And these are just the titles from the control points. So if you have a copy of the standard, you can certainly dig into it. You can look these up and you can find out what the actual instructions are in 27001. If you want more details, you go to 27002. It'll provide probably 2 or 3 pages on each of these controls on how to deal with them. And finally, privacy protection of personally identifiable information. So these are all control points under the organization set. Under the people set, terms and conditions of employment, we want to make sure that employees understand that they are to protect personally identifiable information if that's part of their job. We also want to make sure that we do information security awareness. So we want to raise awareness about the sensitivity of this information. We want to educate people on the tools that they need to use while they're working for our organization in order to protect that information. We need non-disclosure and confidentiality agreements signed. This is very important. This needs to be audited every year to make sure that everyone is signed up. We want to put some rules around remote working because a lot of organizations that handle personally identifiable information do not allow remote working. Okay. Under the physical control, I pulled out a few. We need to have physically secure perimeter. So whatever the building is or the facility is that's handling the personally identifiable information, it needs to be secure. So that's seems like, oh yeah, of course, right? Some people would say it's obvious. Well, this is the point about frameworks, right? Is they're very thorough. This one is kind of lightweight. If you look at the control points total here, it's only 258, right? Now you can add to Annex A if you do more risk assessments and you adopt more frameworks, you can, or more of those regulations, you can insert those controls into here wherever you see additional risk. But this is where you start. This is the benchmark. So yeah, so physical security is important, but if you don't call it out and say it, chances are people won't do it. So it's good and it's important. Also gives us a benchmark to audit against to make sure that people are following it. Working in secure areas. So you might work in a large organization, but maybe not all of the areas have access to personally identifiable information. So for instance, it could be that any PII is encrypted on the technology. So that means that the operations team, technically, the IT team, don't have access to PII. So, but they might be called up to come into an office or a different department of the organization that does have access. So we need to take some additional steps. So for instance, 7.7, clear desk, clear screen. So if you're responsible for handling personal information, you know somebody who's unauthorized is nearby, then you need to make sure that your desk is clear and your screen is clear, and that has to happen. Secure disposal and reuse of equipment. So this is sort of one that we want to give to probably whoever's handling the assets. It could be the IT team, the digital assets. It could be other people. It could be another group doing it. But we want to make sure that this system is wiped of any PII that might have been stored on it. It's a little bit more difficult to do in the cloud. So some of these are not easy to do. Physical controls, not easy to do in the cloud because really we don't have a lot of control. We only have from the operating system up to the business applications, and below that we don't have access. Now I've been in a lot of cloud facilities, so some of them are amazing, so secure, but then there's others that are not so amazing. so you have to go there and probably check it out before you use it. Just because they say that they're ISO 27000 certified too doesn't mean that they are following the rules, because large organizations have a harder time to follow rules and policies. So that's why we have compliance officers and why we do internal audits. Anyway, getting back to technology. So I pulled out a few controls here. So we need to have endpoint devices locked down. We need to have a restriction to any information that's sensitive, like PII. We need to restrict access to source code. So if we have a development team or group, they should not have access to PII. However, any manipulation of their systems could expose the system to disclosure, unauthorized disclosure. So we want to make sure that the source code is handled properly, checked in, checked out, and locked up. And of course, we need to have secure authentication. So we need to know that the people who are logging into the system are the people who we approved to have access to that personally identifiable information. This is also very important. So there's a handful of controls. It's definitely not the full 258, but I'll just give you a little sampling from each of the areas to give you an idea of the value that frameworks bring. Now let's look at a workflow. So we have an employee who gets a request for personal information. They want to evaluate that information. So what do? They first of all verify with the manager that this person has been authorized to access that information. And then we want to validate or verify through an authorization list. So ideally, if we're automating the process, when people get a new job and that job involves PII, then they're going to get added to a group profile, or RBAC, which is roles and responsibilities access control system, which is like a group profile. And sometimes we need to verify with the manager. So if for some reason that person is not on the list, right, then we want to check with the manager of the employee to make sure that they have access. So that's the idea here with this workflow. Okay, so once you understand the information, it has a label on it. It's classified as a particular type of information. It could be corporate information. It could be PII. We check it against the schema. We've already created a schema. Our Chief Cybersecurity Officer or Chief Information Security Officer has probably gone through the process of creating that schema and communicating it out to everybody. And then we want to verify that the information is actually classified. So the label on the actual document or the data asset should tell us what the classification level is. However, when we do training and awareness, we want to teach people what to look for so that they recognize it in case the label is not correct or the label's not there, it's missing. So we apply security standards. So depending on the sensitivity, there's going to be a list of security standards that we're going to apply. I'm going to show you an example in a few minutes. And those cover each of the different types of activities that involve the handling of information. So we'll check that out in a moment. And then finally, you authorize access. So the standards are in place, the person is authorized, they've been authenticated, and now you can grant access. So as you can see, there's a number of controls. Oh yes, and we want to maintain records because records are evidence of authorization. So we don't just give somebody access because they walk over to our desk and ask for it. It has to be somehow in an email, maybe copied to their manager. There has to be some kind of a record, a paper trail of them requesting access in case later on we have a problem and we need to go back and investigate this. Okay, so when it comes to classification schema, there's a number of controls, as you can see, 5.12a. So when you see an A in front of it, that means that it's related to Annex A and not the management system. If there's no A, then you can assume it's the management system. So there's a number of controls for that classification. There's a number of controls over here you can see for the security architecture, which is part of authorization and authentication. It's also part of the endpoint device protection. So there's a number of layers in the security architecture that we go through to make sure that the information is protected. And as you can see, there's a number of levels for classification as well. So one of those levels is private, and that has its own set of classifications. It's going to be higher than a few of the others because it requires more controls. So there's some controls listed here from the framework. And then, of course, there's the security standards that go hand in hand with the classification level. So we have a classification level, and then we have various activities, which I'm going to show you a little closer up. I know you can't see this, but it's just for visual purposes. So these are the standards. And then there's the documentation, of course. So we want to have document policies, procedures, and standards, and we want to record evidence of the use of those for our auditors or for the compliance manager or any external inquiries. Finally, this is a 4-step process really to get certified. Okay, so there's a number of artifacts that come out of this, several documents. We need a privacy policy, we need information handling procedure, we need an information handling procedure. That's sort of the details. Here's the standards, so you can see what the procedure looks like. It goes through a number of the different steps and what each situation requires, and then it will reference back to the security standards, which will actually say, you need AES encryption, or you cannot share this document, or it needs to be shredded when you're done. So there's a number of instructions. There's two groups here. So there's a bucket called manual, human manual. These are the security standards that are applied by our employees and our contractors manually. So they need to follow this. They need to be trained. They need awareness training on this as well. And then there's the machine integrated. So there's a number of things that we can go ahead and integrate into the network and the infrastructure that will help protect us, such as encryption, to make sure that the path that we send data on is encrypted and that its resting place is encrypted. And in the perfect world, we also want that data not to be decrypted for processing. We would like it to remain encrypted while it's being processed. That is possible. That we have the technology. So then we end up with the master services agreement. So we have a policy, privacy policy, external for people that we're collecting information from, and also for our employees. We have information handling procedure and security standards for our employees to teach them how to handle that information. And then we have a master services agreement with flow down clauses. And just like it sounds, flow down clauses are basically when we take the requirements of GDPR and we write them into a schedule. And we attach that to all of our master services agreements. Anybody that touches anything to do with PII on our behalf has to follow. And like the word says, flow down, it's not just them. Anybody else that they use as well. So they have to flow down those clauses to basically the supply chain. So anybody that touches that information or handles that information or touches the equipment that the information is on, they all need to follow the privacy regulations. And we write those into the contract so that it becomes a contractual obligation. Probably put some penalties on that too. And then we need a breach protocol. So if something fails, we need to be prepared to deal with it. Remember we talked about continuity before? Well, it's not just about documenting the information and the knowledge, but it's also documenting the process of what we're going to do in a crisis situation. If we have a breach, what are we going to do? So we need to have that documented and tested. Breach protocol is a good way to go with that. All right. That's my video on frameworks. I hope that you understand clearly that frameworks have a lot of value. It's very different than laws or regulations, so don't get them confused because it's easy to. But they all have different purposes, and because of that, we treat them differently. Frameworks have a lot of knowledge that's been recorded by thousands of professionals who have contributed to it. It's not usually just one person, it's thousands. Like ISO 27001 has thousands literally in 166 countries. Every 5 years they contribute to update those standards and make them viable for the international business community. So it's really good. If you have any questions, please drop me a line. Subscribe to my YouTube channel and keep up to date on all the videos that I've been working on and knowledge that I'm sharing with you. Thank you very much for your time. Have a great day.